One of the reasons I find Ruth an important story for us to learn about is that Ruth tells this story of famine and immigrants. And how do we help those who are outsiders, foreigners, sojourners in the land? What is our obligation to them? In the story that we continue from last week, we find out that Ruth knows that they don't have any food. And she has to figure out how she will feed her and Naomi. And so it turns on the way in which the Israelites had figured out how to feed the poor. In Deuteronomy and Leviticus, it lays out the way that the Jewish people are going to care for the poor. In Deuteronomy, it lists 3 laws. There's the grain field law. When you reap the harvest in your field and overlook a sheaf in the field, do not turn back to get it. It shall go to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, in order that Yahweh, your God, may bless you in all your undertakings. And about olive groves. When you beat down the fruit of your olive trees, do not go over them again. That shall go to the stranger, the fatherless, the widow. And about vineyards. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not pick it over again. That shall go to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And so Ruth, our story, illustrates those passages from the law, right? When Ruth wants to figure out how to feed herself and her mother-in-law, she goes to the fields to glean. So what happens when you go to the fields to glean? The law is prescribed, and it says there will be a corner left aside for the poor to pick and harvest for themselves. But it also says that you can follow behind those who are harvesting. And the rule was, if they dropped 1 or 2 pieces, you could pick that up. If they dropped the whole bundle, they would pick the whole bundle back up. And so Ruth does that today. In our story today, Ruth goes out to the fields, and she asks permission to follow behind those who are gleaning the fields for the harvest. And she does that all morning long. She just, by happenstance, happens to pick a field that belongs to a relative of Naomi, Boaz, who we learned is a kind, warrior-hearted man. And when Boaz returns to the fields, he looks at his men and asks them, who is that girl who's gleaning? And they explain to him that Ruth is the one who came home with Naomi when she returned. She's the one who's been taking care of and sheltering Naomi. And Boaz says to them, when she's following behind you, drop a few extra bits of grain. So lunchtime comes. And Ruth comes over to Boaz to thank him, to express her gratitude. And Boaz starts feeding her lunch now, offering her bread and olive oil, offering her everything that he has there to eat. And she thanks him for what is going on. And he makes her promise that she will only glean in his fields. Because the subtext of this is it isn't always safe for the women and the poor who come to glean in the fields. That they may be taken advantage of, they may be harmed. Does it spell that out clearly? No. But there's no other reason for him to tell her to stay there and to tell them not to bother her, right? And he tells them again, give her extra. So by the end of the day, she has what would be equivalent of 2 of those giant bags of dog food, right? If you were carrying them home, the ones that you're like, oh, please don't make you have to go upstairs with them, right? That's how much grain she has collected that day because Boaz has talked to his people. And he invited her to continue to glean only at his field because she would be safe there. And so what it says is for the entire harvest, so until the fields were cleaned, until they were all harvested, Ruth returned every day to those fields. The next part of our story gets a little tricky. What are our obligations to other people? In the law, it says the obligations, which may or may not have been real and may or may not have been practiced. Although the stories of the ancestors tell of the ways that it had been practiced. That the nearest kin of a widow was to marry her and provide sons so that the line of the dead man could continue. And so Naomi, who has watched and seen how much grain she's getting back, knowing that in reality, the poor, when they glean fields, barely have enough to survive. They have enough to eat, but not enough to be satisfied. Because the law says, depending on the version, the generous version from generous people would be that 1/30 of the field would be given over to those who are poor. The reality was, if you gave grain to the poor, it was more like 1/60 of the field was given. Which is, if there's more than one person, is not going to be enough to satisfy, right? It's not going to be enough to fill you and keep you nourished. And so for her to be filled and nourished means that Boaz has been especially generous to her and Naomi. And so that's when we get to chapter 3. And Naomi hatches the plan on how they will be redeemed, how they will be saved, how their line will continue. And so she sends Ruth, after doing everything you would do to prepare for a wedding, putting on your best dress, getting cleaned up, making sure you are especially presentable, she sends her off to the threshing floor, which there's some suggestions that when the harvest is ended, it's a celebration. It's a sense in which they celebrate not only that the harvest is over, but give thanks to God. So there's ceremony and celebration happening. And so Ruth is told, watch for where he lies down to sleep and go to him and sleep at his feet. I should warn you that that text is controversial and it's unknown what sleeping at the feet means. For some people, it means that they consummated their relationship. For other people, it's unclear whether that happened because it does say feet. But the idea is that Ruth goes there. She goes there, and her job is to make him realize that he needs to be the kin redeemer. He needs to be the one who will continue Naomi's line. And in that passage, as it describes what happens, we hear part of Boaz's blessing. When Ruth and Boaz first talk, they talk about God coming and spreading his wings over and protecting them. And now in this passage, the cloak is spread over the top of Ruth, protecting her. And then he again gives her an ephah of barley, So again, about 50 to 80 pounds of barley to take back home with her. As I was reading this passage, I couldn't help but think about, what does it mean for us about caring for the poor? What does it mean for us about figuring out how we feed those who don't have enough? What do our obligations look like to the poor? Because did you know that in the last 2 years, because of conflict, because of climate change, because of natural disasters, and because of COVID, the amount of hungry people in the world has grown exponentially? That we, in about 2015, had figured out mostly how to feed everybody. The numbers of people who died of malnutrition dropped dramatically. But with the coming of COVID and all of the conflicts, the number of poor and hungry have increased dramatically. And we know how to fix it. Because I can give you the US example. We know how to fix it. What happened last summer to poverty in the United States? We ended it. We ended it in that the tax credits that we gave to those families for the 3 months of the summer where they received $300 changed their ability to function and live in the United States. And yet this past week, 51 senators decided that those tax credits that ended childhood poverty in the United States were not necessary and not wanted. Yet we know they worked. We know that last summer, all of the children in the United States were fed. So we know how to end it. It's a question of, will we end it? I mean, I thought about talking about gleaning, right? Because we have started all sorts of different projects in the United States about what does that look like. What do we do with the food waste at grocery stores? How do we make it available to people that need it? In fact, some communities and countries have made it a requirement that you have to give that food waste away to the poor. We've seen what it looks like when restaurants are set up that are meant to help those who are hungry, so that they provide good, nourishing food that would entice foodies to come to. But the rule at them is, if you have the money to pay what the meal is worth, you pay it. If you don't have the money, you get the meal anyway. We could talk about, what do we do with our own diets? How do we think about the food that we have and the food that we collect and gather? And how, if we change those patterns of food gathering, does it change the way other people receive and experience food? Take, for instance, quinoa. It's not my favorite. Like, if I'm choosing a grain, that's not the one I'm going for, because the flavor is weird. But as a grain, it is one of the most nutritious grains there is. But it only grows in a certain location in South and Central America because of the height and the weather patterns. And all of a sudden, when we decided that that's the grain we should eat, the people who normally eat it no longer can get the grain. That those questions are questions that we need to ask when we think about how do we distribute food around our planet. For example, where I come from in the Midwest, we grow a lot of corn. A lot. And yet, that corn is sold to make gasoline. How inefficient use of land is that? To take the grain and transform it into fuel. That and corn, the way we practice it, is a monoculture. So it destroys the soil, so that means that they have to put all those nutrients back into the soil, and we end up with all these chemicals in the food system because it drains off into the rivers and lakes. What would change if we decided to change how we use the grain we grow and what grains we grow? I mean, there have been studies done since the rise of monoculture agriculture to show that the grains and the food we produce are more likely to survive natural disasters if they aren't a monoculture. If they actually grow the way that they were meant to grow, with all sorts of different varieties of corn and rice and beans growing at the same time. Because if one pest comes and wipes out a certain one, it may be resistant in 2 or 3 others. So you don't lose an entire crop. And yet we decided that it was good to patent the seeds so that people couldn't replant the seeds and harvest the seeds so that they could sow them again. We decided that companies should own the seeds. And those seeds became a monoculture. What changes in our lives if we change the practices of agriculture? Because as we think about this, I want you to just picture northern Africa. In that region, there are natural disasters happening right now. There is flooding and famine occurring. But on top of the flooding and famine, there is these conflicts that are exacerbating the floods and famine. Syria is one of the hungriest nations in the world right now. Because of the conflict there, because of the desire of one powerful person to stay in power, and the resources he has to back up that power. His citizens are starving. In Yemen, the United States and Saudi Arabia have been fighting with Yemen. And because of that, we've created refugees. We've created whole swaths of people who are hungry. But we have the ways and the means to fix this. We know what it takes and how to do it. One of the things we learned in the United States last summer was a prime example, was boost social protection. Because I want you to think about this. In Wisconsin, when I lived there, in order to qualify as a single person for $13 a month, now tell me, how much can you get for $13 a month? Yeah, $13. You have to work 20 hours. But if you work 20 hours, you make more than the amount that will qualify you to get the $13 a month. So $13. It buys you, what? Eggs, rice, and beans, and hope that that will help you? We know that if you change those amounts, because then when I moved across the border to Illinois, they received enough to nourish a single person. enough was given them in income to buy food that they would not be starving. And yes, of course, they have the 20 hours, which is part of the biblical example of Ruth, right? She didn't just get her food. She gleaned her food. But the difference between Illinois and Wisconsin and how they treat the poor is miles of difference. It makes a difference between who has enough to grow up healthy and who doesn't have enough to survive. And one of the things we have learned since women's studies became a field is that if we promote gender equality, if we give our aid to women, that aid focuses back then on children. That the promotion and help we give to every woman changes the amount of food and nutrition that every child gets. That when we set up programs that think about inequality, we change dramatically the lives of other children. So we know the ways to change. But what can we do? What should we do? I thought about that a lot because I know individually many of you give to the local food programs around here. But collectively, what could we do to make a difference to those who are suffering in our own community? How can we start or be part of the programs that are already taking place? Because one of the things that came across my desk, and I don't think it's something we can do because of the daycare, but right now they are looking for a space and a place to start a food bank here in Fremont. A place where they provide the space for people to come in and create their own food and sell that food to the community. It sounds like a wonderful entrepreneurial opportunity for those who are poor. That it's something that we as the churches in Fremont should work together to figure out how it can happen and where it would be possible. A space that has, like our kitchen is not big enough, it's pretty tiny. That has a kitchen that is big enough to support the people who come in to create those meals. What a wonderful opportunity that Fremont could have if we can figure out the space and place to provide the means for the poor to create their own jobs, to feed their own selves. The story of Ruth teaches us to care for each other. That in our story today, last week, Hesed was shown in what Ruth did. This week, Hesed is again shown in what Ruth does. That loving kindness of going out into the fields for back-breaking labor in order to feed herself and her mother-in-law. But Hesed, loving kindness, is also shown in how Boaz responds to Ruth. How Boaz makes sure that she doesn't have an insufficient amount of food to feed herself, but has an abundant amount of food to feed ourselves. May we figure out how to practice Hesed, to practice loving kindness, to learn to care for the poor so that there don't have to be poor among us. Amen.